Now I am going to start the fourth video or part 4 of my presentation which deals with the interwar economy. Again, this section is very important from the point of view of the making of a global world because during the interwar period, economy and other aspects of the entire world was reshaped in a very uh, very important manner. The First World War, which was fought between 1914 to 1918, had deep impact on the entire world. It was mainly fought in Europe, but its impact was felt around the world. It was mainly because the parties in the war, the Allies and the Central Powers, had their connections and colonies in other parts of the world as well. And while they were fighting the war, the colonies were also affected by it. This war plunged the first half of 20th century into deep crisis that almost took over 3 decades to overcome. During this period, the world experienced widespread economic and political instability, changes in social sphere, and all this led to another catastrophic war. In this section, we will deal with wartime transformations because these transformations, in fact, played a very important role in reshaping the economic conditions of the entire world. The First World War was fought between two power blocs. On the one side were the Allies, that is, Britain, France, and Russia, which was later joined by US. And on the opposite side were the Central Powers, which included countries like Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Turkey. Russia had to leave the war midway, that is, in 1917. When the Russian Revolution took place, Russia had to exit the war, and at this moment, US joined the war. It can be called the first modern industrial war where the world's leading industrial countries were involved. The scale of destruction and death was really very, very disturbing. And it was, in fact, unthinkable. Almost 9 million people died and 20 million were injured. Most of the people who died or who were maimed were men of working age. So, a large population of the working age were either killed or they were not in a condition to work further. So women stepped in and they started undertaking jobs because there were no option left for them. Britain lost a lot of money in the war and it was forced to borrow large sums of money from US. So this changed the entire prospects and it was US was in fact becoming stronger day by day. The war transformed the US from being an international debtor to an international creditor. In the post war period, economic recovery seemed almost impossible. We will see few examples of this in the subsequent slide. Britain was a leading economy in the pre war period, and it was mainly because industrial revolution happened in Britain first. Due to industrial revolution, vast resources of raw material, a very developed naval system, Britain was able to play a leading role in the economic conditions of the world. But just as after the war ended, Britain faced a prolonged crisis and it was not able to overcome this crisis very soon. It took long for Britain to recover from this crisis. During the war, when Britain was preoccupied in the war conditions, local industries developed in India and Japan at a very fast pace. Britain could no longer recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian markets because Indian markets were now flooded with local products. Britain was also overburdened with huge external debts in the post war period, mainly because of huge losses that Britain faced during the war period. The war had led to an economic boom due to large increase in demand of industrial goods all over the world. This aided production and employment, but soon after the war ended, production contracted and unemployment increased. Many agriculture economies also faced a lot of crises throughout the world. Before the war, Eastern Europe was a major supplier of wheat, but when the supply was disrupted during the war, wheat production in Canada, America, and Australia expanded. After war, production in Eastern Europe revived, leading to glut in wheat output and subsequent fall in grain prices because the markets were now flooded with wheat from different areas of the world. The next subsection deals with the rise of mass production and consumption. In this section, the assembly line production is very important from the point of view of exam. In the post-war period, the recovery of US economy was much faster than the other parts of the world. The war in fact helped in boosting the US economy and it resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. One important feature of this was the mass production. Now, what exactly was this mass production? The pioneer of mass production was car manufacturer Henry Ford. He adopted the assembly line production in his new car plant in Detroit. What exactly was an assembly line production? In this, the the method allowed faster and cheaper way of producing vehicles, in which the workers repeated a single task mechanically and continuously. This increased the output per worker by speeding up the pace of work. Now, the workers had no time to waste. In this way, the production increased at a very fast pace. The assembly line method allowed a faster and much cheaper way of producing vehicles. To motivate the workers, he kept on offering high wages and repeatedly speeding up the production line. The T Model Ford was world's first mass-produced car. Higher wages offered by Henry Ford improved the purchase capacity of the workers. We see here that car production in in US between 1919 to 1929 more than doubled. So in US the car production rose from 2 million in 1919 to more than 5 million in 1929. So this was actually also responsible for the workers to get better salary and they were now ready to invest for a better living. There was a spurt in the purchase of refrigerators, washing machines, radios, gramophone players through a system of hire purchase. Even if they were not having money, through this system, they could purchase the items in the market. House construction also saw a boom, and house ownership became very common during this period. This house ownership was also financed through the loans. So, this development we see was in a cyclic manner. How it was in a cyclic manner? Now, the higher employment and increased incomes led to higher consumption demand, more investment, and yet more employment. And this way, incomes was increased and better fortunes were created. In 1923, US resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. The Great Depression is another important subsection. It started in 1929 and continued up till the mid 1930s. It affected the economic boom of the entire world in a great manner. As I told you earlier, the Great Depression began around 1929 and it lasted up till mid 1930s. Now, this was a period of economic catastrophe because most part of the world experienced decline in production, employment, incomes, and trade. Now, which section was the worst affected by this economic crisis? As you see, agricultural regions and communities were the worst affected. Why? Because the fall in agriculture prices was much greater and more prolonged than that of the prices of industrial goods. Now we will see the factors which were responsible for the Great Depression. And in this, the first factor was the agricultural overproduction, which led to falling of agriculture prices and decline in agricultural incomes. Farm produce rotted for a lack of buyers. Now, why this happened? If you remember earlier, we had discussed that there was a race among major countries of the world to produce agriculture items and to capture the world market. And in this led to a spurt in agriculture production, and in fact, it led to overproduction. And because of this, there was a great loss in the agricultural sector. In the mid 1920s, countries financed their investment through loans from the US. But as the US overseas lenders saw the first sign of trouble, they decided to withdraw these loans. The countries that were dependent on US loans now faced acute crisis and they were not able to cope with this crisis. The withdrawal of US loan led to failure of major banks and collapse of currencies such as the British pound sterling. This also led to a cyclic fall. How this happened, we will discuss that. US banks also slashed domestic lending. As we had seen earlier, that because of this lending, people were able to buy agricultural and other products, domestic items for a comfortable living. Now, faced with falling incomes, many households in US could not repay what they had borrowed, leading to reduced demands, closing down of factories, and consequent unemployment. So, we see now the cyclic rise of production and better incomes now saw a cyclic fall. India also faced the brunt of Great Depression, and how it did this we'll see in the subsequent slide. We have already seen that the integrated global economy not always had a very bright prospect for everyone. In fact, it also had certain grim situation in certain conditions. India could also not remain unaffected by the Great Depression. In the 19th century, India had become exporter of agriculture goods and importer of manufactures. The Great Depression affected Indian trade also. Indian exports and import nearly halved between 1928 and 1934. During this period, wheat prices fell sharply and almost it was by 50%. But when we see the prospects, we find that rural scenario was much worse and urban scenario faced a better situation. In rural areas, peasants and farmers suffered more than the urban dwellers, mainly because though the agriculture prices fell sharply, the trade in agriculture goods reduced. The colonial government refused to reduce the revenue demands. As far as the urban scenario is concerned, the depression proved less grim for the urban dwellers. Those with fixed incomes, like the town dwelling landowners and the middle class salaried employees, now found themselves much better off as they received regular rents and salaries and they enjoyed their living as they did earlier.